Hello everyone, welcome to the Reconstruction Amendments podcast with Civil Society.
I'm Riker and I'm going to be going over how the 13th Amendment affected the civil rights.
I'm Zaya and I will be talking about the 14th Amendment.
I'm Samir and I'll be explaining the 15th Amendment.
And I'm Benwell. I will be interviewing you guys with questions.
And this time we will be discussing the Reconstruction Amendments, especially the impacts it would end up having on the civil rights in America.
The 13th Amendment was the first amendment to the state's constitution during the period of Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment was necessary because the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln in January of 1863 did not end slavery entirely. The proclamation did not apply to states that remained loyal to the Union. It also exempted parts of the Confederacy that were already controlled by the Union. Even though the 13th Amendment ended slavery, it did not stop discrimination. The amendment's first section declares neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The amendment is unique because it bars every person from holding slaves or engaging in other forms of involuntary work. The 13th Amendment also restricted several different forms of bounded labor. Okay, that's enough of the 13th Amendment. Let's go on to the 14th Amendment. Zaya, you can take it from here.
Let's talk about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment passed by the Senate on June 8, 1866, and ratified 2 years later, on July 9, 1868. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people, and provided citizens with equal protection under the laws. This can be cited at 14th Amendment Senate.gov. Now, moving on, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted citizenship, equal protection, and due process to all people born in the United States. It also prohibited states from denying citizens the right to vote. Here are some more intimate details. Now, when we say equal protection, we mean that prohibits states from denying equal protection under the law. Due process means requiring states to provide due process of the law. Now, moving on to voting rights. Authorize the government to reduce representation in Congress for states that deny citizens the right to vote. Prohibited offholding. Prohibits those who engage in excursion against the United States from holding certain offices. Now to the last one, war debts. Prohibits former Confederate states from repaying war debts. Now, moving on to our next part. This is the impact the 14th Amendment had. The 14th Amendment protections had been extended to include Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Title X of Education, Amendments Right of 1972, same-sex marriage. The 14th Amendment was created to establish equal citizenship for rights. Remember that. Now, why was the 14th Amendment created? The 14th Amendment was created to correct 1857 Supreme Court ruling, Dred Scott Sanford, which stated that black people could not become U.S. citizens, to guarantee equal protection under the law to all citizens, to authorize the government to punish states that denied citizens the right to vote, and lastly, to provide legal bias for African Americans and other groups that challenge against racial discrimination. Now here's some other provisions. The 14th Amendment also prevents states from depriving people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This also prevents political and military leaders who fought against the United States from holding in public office. Now here are the limitations when it comes to the 14th Amendment. However, the 14th Amendment's protections have been limited and undetermined by subsequent legislation, including germ laws and Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment was drafted by a number of legislators, including John Bingham, Jacob Howard, Henry Deming, Benjamin John, and the third Stevens. Here's the explanation for the 14th Amendment. For each and everybody of the legislators who signed the 14th Amendment. John Bingham was a prominent author of the first section of the 14th Amendment. Bingham was a representative of Ohio. He wanted to guarantee equal protection under the law for all citizens. Moving on to Jacob Howard, a senator from Michigan, who stated that privileges and immunities would cause to apply to the states. Moving on, Henry Deming, a representative from Connecticut. Benjamin J. Brown, a senator from Missouri. The third Stevens, a representative from Pennsylvania. Those were all the people who signed for the 14th Amendment. On to my last statements. The 14th Amendment was submitted to the states on June 16, 1996. It became a part of the Constitution on July 26, 1868, when required a number of states ratify it. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. It also extended the Bill of Rights to those states. Thank you for reading about the 14th Amendment. Now, moving on to the 15th.
The last amendment we're going to be covering is the 15th Amendment. So basically, just the 15th Amendment allowed any citizen to vote, no matter race, color, anything like that. However, there were some issues with it, including stuff like how throughout the 1890s people were starting to try to ensure white supremacy. There were measures taken such as grandfather clauses and literacy tests, which basically grandfather clauses were ways to prevent African Americans from voting by exempting certain voters from the new suffrage requirements, such as if their ancestors had been allowed to vote before a certain date. There were also other methods such as poll taxes. The 15th Amendment led to a better future for civil rights, with more legislation being allowed through it and the expansion of things such as the women's rights movement. There was something such as the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which dismantled Jim Crow's restrictive access to voting for African Americans, but this was dismantled by the decision made in the Shelby v. Counter 2013 case, which has led to more colored voting suppression with stricter laws. Although we haven't reached the levels of restriction of the Jim Crow days, there is still more suppression, and these are election-changing votes, keep in mind. Some elections come down to a tiny number of votes cast in a small number of states. The Supreme Court decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, is the reason separate but equal facilities were legalized for more than 50 years. And to secure their rights, African Americans would improve their position through organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League, and through individual efforts, such as reformers like Booker T. Washington and others like him. In conclusion, however, the 15th Amendment would be a great way to keep expanding and overall just improve equality in voting and just our legislation.
Hello, this is Ben. Today we'll be asking Riker, how did the 13th Amendment affect later laws?
The 13th Amendment influenced the later laws in many ways, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It also helped prohibit peonage and other racially discriminatory practices.
Thank you very much, Riker. Now we'll move on to Zaya. Zaya, could you answer this question, please? In what ways did the 14th Amendment affect the U.S.?
The ways that the 14th Amendment affected the U.S. was when it finally freed slaves from slavery. So when that happened, a lot of U.S. American citizens were upset or pleased with this answer, so there's a lot of discourse about it. With the discourse, that comes with a lot of Americans acting out for how they feel towards it, like members like the Ku Klux Klan, which leads to violence and hateful racism across the nation. But there were also people who were just freed, who didn't have everything they needed to get a job, who didn't know what they had to do, and many people discriminated against them. So that led to a lot of discourse and still many more problems that lead up to this day.
Thank you, Zaya, for that lengthy explanation. Now let's move on to our final question. Samir, could you please explain to us and the viewers, how could the 15th Amendment be improved? If so, how could it be improved?
Well, the 15th Amendment had some issues. Even though it did give almost every citizen the right to vote, it was kind of not very well enforced because of things such as poll legislation and Jim Crow. This kind of caused some backlash and some distress for those citizens who couldn't really exercise the right to vote as well as others could, even though they had the right. So with a way to improve it would be putting more measures in place to stop the restricting of others' right to vote.
Okay, thank you. Now signing out, Kai Harada.
Thank you for joining us on our Reconstruction Amendments podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and how it affected future civil rights movements. And that is time.